Eric, do you want to start your meeting first?
Yeah, and we can go ahead and
Yes, I
call
think
for
that
him.
would be appropriate. President Callahan, could you
Yeah.
proceed with calling our meeting to order?
So I would call to order the Batavia Park District Board of Commissioners joint board meeting with the Batavia City Council to order at 6:01. Deb, please call the roll.
Sure. Riley,
Here.
Connolly,
Here.
Tillman,
Here.
Gray,
Here.
and Callahan.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now call to order the special committee of the whole meeting for Tuesday, July 13th, 2021. First item on the agenda would be roll call.
Miller,
Here.
Rosato,
Here.
Beck,
Here.
Knopf,
Here.
Chanzit, Solfa, Wolf,
Here.
Barron, here. Lehman, here. Ayazi, Malay, Ewer,
Here.
Cerrone,
Here.
and Vogelsinger.
Here.
We have 10 out of 14.
All right, thank you. First and only item on the agenda tonight is a discussion for the Batavia River Corridor Master Plan update. Laura, do you want to introduce them?
Yes, Hitchcock Design Group and WBK Engineering are here this evening following the discussion of the initial 4 concepts that were put forth at the last meeting. There was a request to revisit the concepts that were developed in the prior project back in 2000 and hear why those particular concepts either moved forward or did not and how they relate to the 4 that were presented last time. And so here this evening to present that additional information is Lacey Lawrence from Hitchcock Design Group. And I'll stop my share so that she can share any information she has.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. I'm Lacey Lawrence from Hitchcock Design Group. Also with me from Hitchcock Design Group is Bill Inman. And so he's got a kind of a brief introduction, and then I'll run you through some more detailed information regarding the concepts. So I'll give it over to Bill first.
Hey, good evening, everybody. So this evening should be a fairly low pressure evening, despite the importance of this topic. But our objectives for this evening are to do 2 things. Number 1 is to present to you 5 concepts, which would be 4 plus an additional one that we've come up with since our last time we were together, and get some feedback on that. And so looking forward to that part of the advancement. Secondly, we'd like to receive some guidance on which concepts you would like us to go and get some public input on. So we don't have to select a concept this evening. We can eliminate a concept in terms of what we would like to bring to the public, but that's the kind of guidance that we're looking for this evening. So at the conclusion of our last meeting, we were asked to do several things, and we're going to bring that forward this evening. But the first was to show, like Laura was saying, to show the evolution of the planning concepts from the DNR's alternative dam report, and then arrive at a collection of different options for consideration. And so we'll kind of storyboard that for you and let you know how we got from that report to where we're at today, which ones were considered and refined and moved forward, and which ones were not selected for any additional consideration at that time. We were also asked to exclusively illustrate the macro interrelationship between the dam and the depot pond, and just to focus on that only, and not show design examples for what improvements could be developed just yet. So we're going to focus on the river configuration as it relates to the dam and depot pond this evening, and any recreation improvements or public improvements will be a future conversation. We were also asked to be clear about the costs as best as we could at this preliminary time. and what portion that the DNR would likely support, and also what cost would be borne by Batavia for the balance of the work represented in any of these 5 concepts. So we've split up what we think is going to be the DNR's contribution, and what Batavia's cost would be for any of these 5 concepts, to provide some clarity there. Now, preliminary engineering will still have to be, will still be needed for any of these concepts to be advanced, and to refine the costs and to advance the DNR buy-in to fund any particular dam removal scenario. But we have reviewed these concepts with the DNR, concepts A, B, C, D, and E, which you will see here in a moment, and have confirmed that all of these approaches would be conceptually eligible for their dam removal funding program. So they have offered us that at this point in terms of what you're going to see tonight. So again, for this evening, what we're looking for is input on these concepts, and then some guidance on which concepts we should bring to the public in terms of our next step in our data gathering process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lacey to share her screen and to walk us through the concept.
All right. Let's see. All right. Everyone see my screen? So what we are seeing here, this board, is kind of an illustration of kind of the process that we have gone through. And from the start, where we kind of began with the inventory and analysis of the site, reviewed all of the relevant planning documents to develop the current concepts that we're presenting with you and gathering input from you today. So up at the top here is the alternative evaluation report. So these examples, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4A, and 5, these represent all the alternatives that were evaluated back in that report back in 2000. And so from that report, gathered some additional information, as well as it has been, over 20 years since that report was done. We evaluated some new concepts, and those are kind of what you're seeing like in this second row. So these are refined options for your consideration today. So as you can see, some of these from the initial evaluation report were evaluated to be advanced further and presented. And some have these big red X's because during the report, they had some different indicator that kind of prohibited it from, whether it was cost, permitting, all of those kind of factors that kind of limited it from being advanced further for consideration. And so I'll go ahead and go through each one of these. So you can see we've kind of expanded on alternative 1, we've expanded on alternative 4A, and then we've presented some additional concepts here that were not originally evaluated. So let me kind of zoom in. Right. So this one right here is alternative 1. So in this alternative, this is one that you have seen at the last presentation. This was our option B. And so in this concept, it created a berm between the north end of the Riverwalk to Duck Island, and created a series of rock weirs, kind of starting up here at 6 foot and kind of stair step down to where the current dam is that would be modified until we got down to elevation 0, which is essentially the current water elevation of the Fox River. Honestly, in doing so, essentially created a new impoundment at the north end here, which maintained the current elevation of Depot Pond. And so this one, after further evaluation for various metrics, we decided that this was a viable option that still would be relevant today. And so we continued to advance this option for consideration. As we move next, so this was alternative 2. So the main characteristic of this option was a bifurcated main channel of the Fox River. So essentially this is similar to what was done at Yorkville. And so we have on one side a new step dam, kind of in the area of the current dam. We have like a concrete separating wall. And then again, kind of a similar stair step down, starting at like elevation 6, all the way down to elevation 0. And so some of the outcomes of this one that kind of limited it from being advanced further was the fact that it required installation of a flood control berm that protected the retirement community in the event of a flood. Because what it does essentially is it lowers, the flood elevation now would encompass most of this property in this concept. So with that, as well as at the time, it determined placing too much recreation action in front of the community was not preferred, as well as it kind of had negative ramifications to the current infrastructure of some of the Riverwalk improvements. So this option was not advanced or presented to you at the last meeting. However, since then, we have kind of made some changes to this to present like a new concept to you, but I'll get to that, in a second. So that was alternative 2. Alternative 3 essentially removes the existing dam and puts in a new step dam. So essentially a step dam kind of eliminates like the rolling effect, that the current dam has. So if you go over it, it's considered a bit safer, and that there's, that spinning, churning water at the end kind of is reduced in this kind of dam style. So this concept, we get a new dam in the place of the current one, so it still maintains that impoundment upstream of the dam and maintains the current water elevation of Depot Pond. And this alternative to create a safer bypass channel, this was planned to go through the cut, kind of through here is the current parking lot and the retirement community. Peg Bond is over here. And so this concept, wasn't considered for advancing for several reasons. Obviously, one, the cost implications for construction and maintenance, and having to reroute roads and parking lots and current infrastructure made it not an advantageous concept. It reduced safety or increased safety for boat passage over the dam, but obviously not as ideal as not having a dam altogether. It did provide some fish passage, having them go through the whitewater course or over the step dam. But obviously during low tide or low flow conditions, it might be hard for fish to be able to find the entry here of this whitewater bypass to make it through. And, if they can't go over the dam during low flow conditions. This one did have some positive outcomes as well. It did create a unique regional attraction, with the whitewater course. But that does come with some negative implications of having to put in a pump in order to be able to add additional flow to make the course more challenging if you wanted to attract any type of, regional events based around the whitewater course. And obviously, because the dam is still in place, it had very limited water quality improvements, but it did tick the box as far as maintaining the current elevation of Depot Pond. So that kind of in a nutshell was option 3. And so that option wasn't considered for advancement for those reasons that I mentioned. And then we move kind of into option 4. And this one is kind of a combination of several of the alternatives. So in this concept, it did create a land berm from the north end of the Riverwalk. Instead of kind of going like this directly over to the bank, it does encompass part of Duck Island before it heads over to the bank. And so in this concept, it does kind of hydraulically separate Depot Pond from the main channel. And it does then also kind of take some of those aspects of the alternative 1, where it creates kind of a series of rock weirs or grade control structures to kind of drop in elevation. And this one, in order to kind of save on some of the costs, because the initial one was rather long, extended all the way to the north end of Duck Island. This was a minimal, a reduced footprint for these rock weirs. But in doing so, it did reduce some of the water surface elevation going upstream. And it did require some modification to the current dam. So obviously this option wasn't considered for advancement for various reasons. Again, it did kind of increase, safety concerns for boat passage. It does have some benefit for fish passage as well as habitat improvement with some of the rocks and riffles. It does have some improved water quality because the water impoundment is reduced a bit upstream. And it does create a bit of a recreation amenity, not as much as the whitewater course does, but it's still, of interest. And because the depot pond is isolated from the main channel, it does maintain the elevation. It does reduce the sediment load to depot pond, but a negative outcome is obviously this would require some routine pumping in order to maintain the current water elevations. So that was option 4, and it's very costly because it does include the berm and the rock weirs. So it's kind of several concepts in one. So it's ideally very costly option. So for those reasons, we didn't advance option 4. And then we move into 4A. So this is one that you did see at the last presentation. This one was actually renamed option A from last time, if you remember. So in this option, we remove the dam entirely. And so therefore the impoundment upstream, the water surface elevation does drop 6 feet. And then in order to maintain the current elevation in Depot Pond, it requires the construction of an earthen berm kind of from the north end of the Riverwalk to the bank. And so again, similar to kind of option 4, this does require some routine pumping in order to maintain the elevations of Depot Pond. And I'll kind of go into that when we get to our final concepts for consideration. But that's kind of that one in a summary. And then the last alternative that was presented in the report is alternative 5. And so this option can put in a new step dam where the current dam is now. And then it essentially creates a whitewater course through the core of downtown. So down at the south end here of Depot Pond, it goes through buildings, streets, until it outlets kind of down here by Mains. And so obviously this option was not considered for advancement. For one, it was very costly, challenging to implement as far as permitting, as well as impacts to current infrastructure, roads, buildings, and requires significant acquisition of land. And so this option was not considered for advancement. So just zoom out here again. Kind of summary. And so here's alternative 1, 2, 3, 4, 4A, and 5. So again, we considered advancing 1 and 4A from those options. And so this brings us to where we are now. So our options for
Can't hear you. About 2 boxes.
So our options for consideration currently are option A, B, C, D, and E. So at our last meeting, we presented on A through D. And so E would kind of be the new concept that you haven't seen yet. It's essentially a version of alternative 2. Let me zoom in here again. So again, as we presented, this is option B, very similar, essentially exactly the same as alternative 1 that was in the report. And then alternative E is the new one. So this is a variation of alternative 2. Essentially what it takes is the concept of the new step dam and the bypass channel, but it switches them. So now instead of having the step dam along the east bank, the step dam is on the west bank, and our bypass channel is now on the east bank. And we also have kind of reduced the footprint to a kind of a minimal length in order to achieve the drop that we need with a certain elevation to maintain, a more recreation-based bypass rather than a more challenging, moderate to high flow in the channel. And so what this does is since the dam is on this side, it maintains the current water drop in the flood elevations that are there now. So therefore kind of alleviates the need for the flood wall along this bank here. And because we currently have walls on the east bank, the elevation change with the water and flooding in this area would be less of a concern, but we'll have to be modeled, obviously, if we advance this concept further to ensure what those flood elevations will be and how it impacts current infrastructure. So going forward, this is obviously considered a little bit less costly than option B was because of the limited footprint, the length of the channel improvements are less, so therefore the cost is a little bit less. It still creates a recreation amenity through the bypass. Is beneficial for fish and for boat passage since we have the bypass channel being in the main channel. Again, a lower water quality benefit because we still are maintaining the impoundment with upstream of the dam. It maintains the current surface water elevation of Depot Pond without requiring the need of routine pumping. And then we can also possibly provide additional options for portage. And then move on to option C. So this is one we presented last time, so I won't go into too much depth on C and D. But essentially, C was the concept where we remove the dam entirely. So it reduced the water surface elevation upstream of the dam. And in order to maintain some amount of open water within Depot Pond that didn't require pumping, so it'd be hydraulically connected to the main channel, was by excavating the north end of Depot Pond. So it drops the surface water elevation down 6 feet. By excavating it, maintains the current depth that the pond is now. It'll just be, the water surface elevation will just be lower by 6 feet. And then at the south end, converting some of this to park open space, to be determined on what that would look like in the future. And then option D was essentially very similar, where we removed the dam entirely, but in option D, we restored kind of this north area with native restoration, seeding, plants, and then converted the south end to like parks and open space. And then option A, which is a variation of alternative 4A, again, created the land berm separating Depot Pond from the main channel. And so kind of with that, we did evaluate each option for costs, so that, it's always plays a significant role in decision making. We do have kind of the matrix here off to the side. Zoom into that real quick, where we evaluated each of the options for consideration based on some of these design criteria as well as cost effectiveness. So most, all the options, again, why IDNR will support kind of each of these concepts, because it does provide a safer passage for boats in all the concepts. All the concepts do provide some amount of fish passage. Some have additional kind of recreation amenities, whether we do the whitewater bypass or the whitewater course. All of them still allow for flood conveyance. Some, obviously, in the concepts where we remove the dam entirely, obviously we have improved kind of water quality because the upstream impoundment is no longer there. We have more of a free-flowing river condition. And then most of the concepts maintain some amount of Depot Pond. Some of these have obviously varying amounts of maintenance, long-term maintenance involved. So we kind of check the boxes for the ones that might require more maintenance, whether it be for pumping or installing kind of a new dam that will have to be maintained, and as well as cost effectiveness. So this is the one where we broke down the estimate for each of these concepts by what the IDNR would be willing to fund, essentially the removal of the current dam, and then what kind of costs would fall into Batavia's responsibility for those improvements. And so as you can see, the least expensive option is going to be option D, where essentially we just remove the dam and only kind of restore the banks, native plantings, native seeding, restored Depot Pond in a similar fashion. So that's obviously the least expensive option. And kind of summarize, I guess, IDNR essentially is only going to pay for the dam removal in all of these options. So that's why the cost kind of is essentially the same for all of the varying options here. The second least expensive would be this option here, option A, where we create kind of a land berm here to separate dam and Depot Pond. Obviously, this cost does not include what the long-term maintenance would be for the annual pumping for the year. Then the next least expensive one would be option C, where we excavate out Depot Pond to maintain like the northern portion of Depot Pond. And then option B and E are very similar in cost. Obviously, as we kind of discussed when we ran through the options, how option E is a little bit more cost effective just due to the limited run of the whitewater course rather than extending it the full width of the channel and over 900 feet in length. So with that, let me kind of open it up to any questions that we have on the current presentation. And then we kind of move into discussions.
And Lacey, if I could maybe point one last thing out. For the concepts that require any fill within the river, such as concept A, where we're creating a land bridge between the peninsula and the land to the west, anything where we're putting fill in the river will require some form of mitigation of that fill somewhere else along the river. So those solutions would be further evaluated if any of those options were considered.
Steve, I have a question in regards to that, and that is, do we get any credit for when the dam is removed for that compensatory storage? Or would the earthen berm be completely 100% that we would have to provide that? Because we are removing product from the river.
That's a good question, Eric. I'm not sure of that answer. I don't know if John, if you know what that answer is at this point, or if that's something we'd have to look into.
Yeah, it's something we look into a little further, but it depends on the timing. You know, if the dam is removed and the river level lowers, obviously some areas would not be floodplain then after the dam is removed. So depending on timing, if the dam is removed and you come back later and do those improvements, I think there'd be less of a permitting obstacle, but it would require doing those at a later date, say maybe a year or two later. So
I have an add-on question to that, really, basically the same thing. But if we were going to build a park open space like in C and D, when you do that dredging, is that dirt just unusable to create a park? Maybe this is a question for Eric. I mean, can you use that at all, or is it just too waterlogged and damaged in the short term to really do anything? So which kind of throw away?
I can answer that question. You know, it depends on what the soil is, and if there's also any sort of contaminants, you would have to haul that material off. And then if it is just not a stable material, it would also have to be hauled off. So that's one of the big questions as far as cost goes with that option, because we don't know what that soil condition is. If we can reuse it, it reduces the cost significantly.
I left you instructions.
If not, it drives the cost up.
So basically C and D, we don't really have.
Whatever amount of meat you're going to use, put that sauce.
We don't really have a good cost estimate for C and D because we don't know what that dirt's going to be like. And actually, I would like to ask Eric, something that comes out of the water like that, I mean, even if it doesn't have contaminants, can you really make a good park out of it? Or is it really something that you would still put some fill over the top of it to get some sort of good compact soil to make a park?
You would have to build into the specs on the removal, besides the testing, to amend the soil with an active organic material.
Yeah, so I mean, we really don't have cost estimates then for C and D because of what John said and what Eric said. We have no idea what this dirt's going to be like, and we still have to put a ton of dirt over the top of it to make it a useful park. So you really can't just make a park by just transferring dirt or just filling in with dirt, right?
Well, you can make a park by filling in with dirt, but
yeah, but now we got to truck in, you know, how much, I mean, that's a ton of dirt. I mean, I'm not saying a ton, it's a lot of dirt, right? I mean,
correct.
You know, and we have no idea how much dirt that's going to be and what the cost is going to be. So we really have no cost estimates for C and D is what I'm saying.
They could vary. Yeah, it is variable depending on the soil conditions of those of Depot Pond.
Okay.
I have a question for John, kind of along those same lines. That channel that the Depot Pond was created from is not the natural channel of the Fox River. So when that goes to be either bermed off or whatever we decide to do with it, because that's not the original or natural channel of the Fox River, how does that affect, you know, your compensatory storage ability there if that's not truly the original channel of the river? Because where the dam is where the original channel of the Fox River was. Right. I don't know who wants to try to answer that.
Could you repeat that? I kind of missed it.
The channel, if say we were going to berm off the Depot Pond and turn that into basically a true pond separate from the river, that was a man-made channel that was not part of the original natural river. So would the DNR or Army Corps of Engineers take that into consideration as far as what we could do or how we could fill that in?
I believe their interpretation would be looking at the river the way it is right now.
Mhm.
And then, if we're filling that in as to the conditions that are there now, that would be a fill and that would have to be compensated for.
Okay. Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, or question and or comment. I think one of the things that hasn't really been mentioned, we keep on talking about the water level dropping with A, C, and D in the river to the north. But what we keep on failing to mention is that the river is going to shrink dramatically. It's 600 feet across right now, and it's going to shrink to 300 to 400 feet across. So the vista, what you see right now, will be completely different. And I understand native plantings and everything. That's going to take a very long time to restore that much land to native plantings. And I'm not a landscape architect or anything, but I question the cost. It would seem to be, probably a decades-long project at least. And you're always going to have to be in there. We're in Fabian South right now, taking out all the invasive species. We have volunteers doing that, but at what point does that become cost prohibitive in the future to maintain that? And if you look at the IDNR stuff, that goes all the way back to Geneva, the Fabian Forest Preserve up there, because it's going to affect that land too. I think the new channel they created disappears.
Just north of the island that is in the river right now with the bridges connected to it, and Fabian is where the effect of our dam ends.
Yeah, so I think that new cut that they just did that turns to mud was what I saw on the thing. So that's hugely impactful, and that's why I've said it before that keeping that with options B or E kind of keeps everything the same. And relatively speaking, you don't have to have that continued maintenance of those things forever, basically.
But realize that low water will still be what it was at low water now, or very close to it.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Realize then, with the dam still controlling the water level of the pond level will change. And at low water, it will be similar to what it was earlier this year.
But don't forget, it's low right now because there's nothing holding it back because there's a breach. So the breach never allows the water to come up to the top of the dam. The water is always flowing, so it's always going to keep to that level of the top of the dam, which it's not right now. And it's shrunk again. We got a lot of rain, but I just drove over it today and I'm like, wow, it's shallow again because it's not getting to the top of the dam because it can't. So B and E allow it to come back up to the level that we're historically used to. And I know people can say, well, historically it was never there, but speaking for the homeowners along there, I'm pretty sure they didn't expect that a water feature filled by the river would disappear at any point when they were buying their property. It's one thing you buy property facing a farm that you shouldn't expect the farm is always going to be there. But when you buy waterfront property on a river, you kind of expect it's going to be there.
I knew 18 years ago that the state wanted the dam out of there, and they're working actively to get all the dams off the Fox River. I think the only thing that they effectively want to leave on the dam is Stratton up north and Dayton at the south end, and that's it.
Understood. We have options to keep it looking without, they all cost a lot of money. There's no doubt they all cost a lot of money. And B&E may have a higher upfront cost, but I would imagine that B&E are going to have the lower long-term cost.
Okay, go ahead.
This is Alderman Lehman for those online. I have a couple questions regarding the pump, and this may have been brought up in some other meetings, but do we know the yearly cost of the maintenance if we went with a pumping system?
I can answer that. It's really hard to determine, depending on the soil conditions and how much the water seeps out of the pond, how much water comes in from the surrounding area, running directly off into the pond to maintain a water level, and really just the rate, the conditions throughout the year, as far as if we're in a drought or if it's a wet year. So it's really hard to determine exactly what that cost will be. And so, you know.
We don't even have a ballpark.
I would, I hate to throw a number out there. It could be 50 to 100,000. I'm just really just ballparking it. It just depends on the year and how much water just, seeps into the soil and out through the system on a daily basis.
And are there other local municipalities that have effectively used pumps like in Concept A?
There's ponds that are fed by pumps and to maintain its water surface elevation. I don't have any examples, but there are throughout Illinois.
And then one additional question. Do any of these concepts have additional parking, public parking being added?
Those kind of features are something that we will be evaluating kind of in the second stage of the master planning process. The activity that we're trying to focus on at this first half is more the relationship between the dam and depot pond and its implications upstream and downstream. And so once we kind of have a preferred concept or approach for that, we can then go in and layer over the top of that for recreation amenities, paths, trails, parking. So that will come kind of more in the future, a couple more months from now, essentially. And we'll have those kind of for your consideration.
Anybody else on the council have any questions? Anybody online have questions from the Park District?
So this is Kevin with the Park District. Speaking of upstream, will the effect or plans of Geneva or St. Charles to build a water recreation, taking out their dams, affect the water level of any of these, coming downstream, restrict the water, or is the water volume going to be the same regardless of what recreation St. Charles or Geneva puts in around their dams in the future?
I believe the water level will be, the water volume will be the same. It won't restrict. I mean, any improvements upstream would not overly restrict the flow coming downstream. It would more just be a free flow more than anything, and just maintain the existing conditions that there are there now.
Anybody from the city council?
I think Alderman
online?
Brown wanted to speak.
Nick,
Yeah, I had a question. I don't know if there's any revenue produced or anticipated by some of these options have the bypass courses. Is there any type of economic revenue that we can count on that, or is it too nominal to even include in a cost benefit analysis in drawing people to these courses or items on the river?
Yeah, as presented now, the one that would probably produce the most regional draw specifically for whitewater would be like option 3, essentially, where you're creating an off-channel course where that you can then divert additional water to speed up the flow to create more challenging situations through the bypass. So this one, as far as whitewater goes, this one would be like the most advantageous for that. The rest of it, the rest of these options have been more focused on is just creating a safer passage for non-motorized watercraft as well as fish passage, more of a way to bypass the dam than it is to really create a regional, like a recreation attraction.
I ask because, for us, cost is a huge determinant through these options. And if there's a way to allay some of the costs with increased revenue. Some of those things are appealing to people, to me, but I don't know if it's worth it or not. So that's why I ask. I guess that's a discussion for us separately, or that'd probably be a park district revenue source, perhaps. But if we're drawing people to downtown, it could be additional revenue too. That's hard to quantify.
I have another question, just off the wall question about these pumps that would help feed the pond and some of these options. How are these things located? Are they above the water or below the water? Is there any natural resource that can power the pump, like the river, that can actually power the pump? Or is it something that it's a constant draw on the city and resources to power these pumps? Is there noise? Are they dangerous to fish? I need to know more about how these pumps work before I can even, I mean, right now they're a non-starter for me just because I don't know anything about how these things work.
We haven't really done any in-depth analysis on the pumps, although, they wouldn't be, my experience, they wouldn't be continuous because, water would still be feeding into Depot Pond at certain times of the year. You wouldn't need that. I believe the pumps would provide some benefit with regards to aeration, water quality, and any algae that may be produced in the river. Those would have to be fed from water from the river, and that would have to be some sort of structure that captures the water to be able to pump it up into Depot Pond. Like I said, we don't have any specifications or costs on that right now in this conceptual stage, but it would pump from the river to Depot Pond intermittently throughout the year. And it would have to be, these pumps are usually large volume pumps. You would need a large power source. It wouldn't be hooking up any sort of solar system to a pump. It would require direct electricity to
I
power.
wasn't talking solar, I was talking hydro, but.
Oh, okay.
So again, and for reference, the reason I asked that question, it was actually is that those are two other options or other options that we really don't have an idea on the costs. So, if we took options that we have to move dirt and try to make a park and don't have any idea of the quality of the soil or whatever, we have options where we have pumps that we really have no idea about the cost, how they would operate, whether or not it can be supplemented with some sort of natural resource. Those are all options to me, and this is just my opinion, that we really have no idea what those costs are. So outside of some of the things like B, where we're throwing some rocks and concrete in, and E, again, where we're throwing some rocks and concrete in, where we can try to get some firm costs, we have really no idea what these other things cost, in my opinion.
I just wanted to clarify one thing too with option B and E. Essentially, these are putting in new dams. So essentially, they'll have to be monitored and maintained as a new class 3 dam. So they will also require some
Understood, but that's no different than what we have today, really. I mean, but what I'm saying is there's so many unknowns in these other options. And maybe, Pat, you have a better idea of the construction of some of these things than I do. But all I'm saying is what I see is I see a gross number, but then I see a bunch of things that we have no idea what their ongoing costs and or just their initial cost to install and operate would be. And that's really concerning to me because I can't really make an evaluation because I don't know what they would actually cost. We get into it and it costs $4 million more than what we said. We're in a lot of trouble.
Well, we do know that the initial cost of a pumping system would be around $300,000 to $400,000. As far as the maintenance and pumping costs throughout the year, we don't have a really good handle on that right now.
So, John, I'll respond to your comments, and then I have a couple of my own. I want to share some thoughts. We did quite a bit of investigation back when the berm option seemed to be floating to the top as the likely determinant to maintain the level of Depot Pond and the pumping. And there was some projections that the long-term maintenance was going to be significant. And I don't know the exact numbers, but it wasn't as simple as just putting a pump in and letting the pump run. There was a lot of annual maintenance to the pumps to make sure they were running properly, make sure the flows, the additional cost of energy to operate the pumps, etc. So I think, to your point, having something that has a less reliance on not only energy consumption for a sustainability perspective, but also from a long-term operations perspective with respect to the governmental agencies that would be responsible for whatever solution is ultimately decided upon. So I think we do need to have, or try to get to quantify, and maybe Eric, I think in Jim Eby's files, we had some information early on when we were doing those evaluations back in 2000, 2001. There may be some information in the file at the Park District on that that might be useful to the design team.
Absolutely. We can obtain that.
Okay. So just a couple of comments. I've obviously, like many of you probably have gotten emails from a number of citizens as we've gone through this process. And, you know, the ones I've received have overwhelmingly been to try to maintain some level of dam, if you will, in the river. So I guess I'm gonna kind of go back a little bit to say, you know, these are all good options, right? They all obtain some objective, but I think as a group, both at the city and the Park District, what are our objectives, right? I mean, you know, obviously the health of the river, removing a over 100-year-old dam that's broken, that needs to be repaired, you know, that needs some attention. You know, what are we trying to obtain in the final analysis, right? I mean, I think some of these things are interesting with creating more parks and infilling that I think have some unintended consequences. You know, the amount of insects that will be in downtown Batavia would grow exponentially for people to enjoy outdoor activities in the summertime in downtown Batavia if we have some of these restored areas, in my opinion. I think if it's the health of the river, you know, we know why IDNR wants to get out of the dam business. It's that, I mean, yes, it's the health of the river. Nobody contests that, right? We want to make sure that the river's healthy and that the fish life and wildlife in the river can be healthy. I also, I guess, feel pretty strongly that in improving or enhancing the recreational opportunities is a primary objective, at least of the Park District. And I think generally for tourism, if you will, in Batavia, which would be a wise on all of our parts to bolster activities in the community. I want to be careful, and I guess I'm going to challenge the design team. I think some of your costs are a little aggressive, particularly on B and E in comparison to the others. I think we need to make sure that we're not, you know, just kind of saying, well, we want to be conservative because that looks like a big project. And I'm not arguing that you haven't really had a lot of detailed analysis and you're using some historical numbers and some good engineering judgment to come up with these numbers. But I think before we share this with the public, I think the numbers need to be more realistic by their comparisons to each other, so that objective evaluations can be made of each option. I really appreciate the additional work on option E. I know at the Park District in 2000, you know, having the riffles or the weirs and using the river in a more recreational mode was something that was critically important to the Park District and much of the constituents that addressed us at that time. I realize there's both sides of this argument about a complete removal of the dam and one that obviously you know, presents itself in the form of C, D, or A with respect to trying to kind of compensate for the dam removal. I will just leave you with one final thought. the Park District was saddled with some unintended consequences for the removal of the South Dam and spent nearly $2.5 million rehabilitating the quarry as a result of the waterfall. We were told by the engineers that the water fall, based on all of the science and all the calculations, was not going to be as severe as it actually ended up being. So I guess my fear is if we're too aggressive in evaluating C, D, and E simply because they're cheaper, I think that there may be some unintended consequences that we may be facing as a community that we're going to be challenged with. At least we know that B and E can be effectively leveraged, much like the original dam, without the breach, and have a historical understanding as to how the river will react to that. So I guess I'm to some degree tipping my hand, because I think there's a value in B and E beyond the costs. And I'm certainly one to be very sensitive to our tax dollars here in our community. But let's face it, the dam is over 100 years old and we haven't spent a penny on it in 100 years. When you look at this over time, I think we need to look at these numbers over time and not just as a first cost analysis. So I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Thanks, Pat. Joe.
Hey, this is Alderman Knopf. I've got a couple of questions, and Pat, you just drove my questions. In the presentation, you said option E is like what they did in Yorkville, only the sides are rivers. So they've got a partial dam, they've got partial piers. We find out what it cost Yorkville to do that. If they did something just like what we're looking at doing, I would think we'd be able to get a pretty good idea of what the costs are to do that. The second question would be, how long ago did Yorkville do that? And has anybody studied the impact and the effect it had on the river since they did that? It addresses the other question you asked, what's going to happen? We'll throw those questions out to the Hitchcock group.
And John, I might pass it over to you as in regards to some of those questions, but I know, like, obviously this is modeled similar after Yorkville, and obviously the stretch of the river in that section of the river mile is significantly larger, wider than we're currently working with here in downtown Batavia. So obviously the costs aren't going to be exactly the same. We're trying to make a limited amount of whitewater course to kind of keep the cost implications reduced compared to the overall length that was done by Yorkville. And at that point in time, obviously IDNR funded a little bit more for that improvement than they are doing at this time. They're kind of establishing a new criteria for their grant, for their dam removals. So we'll probably get a little bit less than what they received for their modifications, as well as I think they had some more like appropriations that allowed them to fund some of these additional enhancements above and beyond, what IDNR funded for those improvements. But as far as the overall cost, I'm not aware of what that is. So I might see if John from WBK might be able to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we had a meeting with IDNR last week, and we discussed the costs on that. They provide us with the cost of what the Yorkville Dam was. We haven't received those numbers yet. We're hoping to get those this week and have a better idea of cost and comparison with alternative dams.
Lacey, I think we're getting some feedback from your audio. If you could mute and that works.
Sure.
Yes. Okay, there. John, could you repeat your answer?
Sure. Yes, we had a meeting with IDNR last week. They discussed the Yorkville Dam. They were going to provide some numbers to us for cost for that dam modification. We have not received those numbers yet. So once we do, we will have a better idea of comparison and costs for alternative E.
Your Honor.
Yeah, let me throw a few history notes into this whole conversation. 60 years ago, in 1961, Art Swanson, who later owned the hardware store down here, was elected mayor of Batavia. And Mr. Swanson had the vision that he needed to take more of the centralized area of the downtown and add some more commercial activity to it. And one of the things that needed to be done was they needed to fill in what they called the second channel of the Fox River. So I was told a story by Mr. Swanson and by Francis Yelsey, who was then the city attorney of Batavia, that in 1961, they got in a car and drove down to Springfield to the Illinois Division of Waterways. I guess that's what it was called at the time, to have a discussion about what they needed to do to go about filling in the second channel of the Fox River. Now, the second channel of the Fox River in those days is depicted on the back wall there in that Saturday Evening Post cover that everybody's quite familiar with. It was done in 1958. What most people don't realize is they look at it today or put one up in their house. When John Falter painted that picture, that was not the pond that we have today. That pond that's painted there was a pond that ran all the way down to Wilson Street. And there was just a stream of water that went underneath a second bridge that was in front of today's Walgreens. And then there was another huge body of water that went down to First Street. And then that went underneath First Street and went into what was then the bowling alley and the Shumway Foundry property. Then it went over a bridge that we had down there for railroad cars to go over to get into the body company. And so there was this thing is much different than it was 60 years ago. But what came back from Francis Yelsey and Art Swanson's visit to the Illinois Division of Waterways in those days is that they got down there and they said to the division, what would your opinion be if we filled in the second channel of the Fox River? And Francis told me he was kind of amused by the response they got was, what second channel of the Fox River? And he says, well, there's a second channel. It's been dug in the Fox River that goes all the way. There's two channels of the Fox River that goes through Batavia. Well, the state didn't have a lot of records of that. In fact, they said, well, it must have been that when they were building the windmill factories and moving out the limestone and building the Newton wagons, there was a lot of people that just did things. And one of the things they did was they needed water power because in, 150 years ago, you didn't have electricity. So you needed the water to power, the activities in the windmill factories and whatever have you. So we don't have, trust me, I've had over the years, we've had a lot of people in here wanting to go into the city records and find all the records of all this activity. And poor public works folks, we're constantly kind of discovering new things that have happened that nobody ever wrote down or told us anything about or anything else. This was all just kind of created. So just as a couple of points of information, we've had some interesting situations here in the last couple of years. We had a gentleman commit suicide one night, and he came down in his car and he drove into the Fox River up at the boat club. And then with our city, one of our city snowplows was going by. It was a snowy night, and he saw a flash in the car, and the gentleman shot himself in the head, and the car floated down to near the Challenge Dam, and then it submerged itself and went down in the water. So the Batavia Fire Department, it was dark out. We needed to, respond to this. So our chief got up there and he called for the Aurora Fire Department to come up with their dive team. Now I was standing there when this happened, and Aurora gets up there and Aurora puts their suits on and they jump into the Fox River right there above, just north of where the Challenge building is now. I'm on the east bank of the river where this is all happening. Aurora jumps in the water, and within a couple of minutes, the Aurora guys come back out of the water and they say, our chief then, Chief, we've never seen a Fox River like this before. How deep is this? And the chief said, well, he wasn't sure how deep it was. And they said, we think you got at least 30, 40 feet of depth in the Fox River right here at this particular part of the Fox River. And he said, we went down there and that gentleman's in that car. We can see him, he's dead. We're going to recommend that you stop this operation now, and we'll come back tomorrow in the daylight and we'll try to do this because this is highly dangerous and the depth of this water is very problematic for us. So the decision was made. We let the gentleman stay down there all night, and then the next day they came back with big tow trucks, and Aurora went back down and hooked up the car and got it out of there. So we found out that one of the deepest parts of the entire Fox River is right there at the north end of the old Challenge buildings. Now, we're told that was done, I guess, because we were trying then to force the water of the river as it came south to go toward the deeper part of the river, which then would put it underneath the Challenge windmill factory buildings, and they could then use the water power to run the factory. And the Challenge had the building that's still standing up there at the north end still has the river bed underneath it that's probably not being used. There may be some trickles of water in there, but there's not much. And then beyond that, they had a second building that sat out on top of the Fox River. And when it was about 1983, 84, somebody went down there and dropped a match in that, and the thing burned up and all the fell into the river and went away. We still got the pylons sitting down there in the river just south of the dam that you see people ask, where do these pylons come from? Well, those pylons are where this building sat that they ran all the water power for the Challenge. So then we get down here south of the bridge, right next to where Walgreens is, and this is where there was another big body of water, and the U.S. Wind Engine and Pump Company came in. And when they built themselves about 1860, they built right on top of the river, and they had these buildings with all these wheels in there, and they were doing all this other kind of good stuff. And then the Van Noordtreeks came in and built this building. This was the last of the windmill factories to be built, the room we're in right now. And they started, believe it or not, they built this, but we have pictures of this building as a one-story building. And then somebody came along and told Mr. Van Noordtreek, well, it's kind of a tricky thing here. What are you going to do if that river rises some night and you're going to flood your place out? So Van Noordtreek then supposedly got the idea he'd build 2 more floors onto this building. So if it flooded, he could throw everything on the elevator and go up in the air. And so if you look at the topography of the ceilings here, you can see that there's a lot of support built into this building, and that's built to hold the upper 2 floors of this building that weren't originally there when it was built. Then Van Noordtreek came up with the idea of building the cut, which is still out here today, that goes over to River Rain. And, you know, when we did the river walk, we kind of recreated that, but that was again another way to capture this water. So then as things going on in the 1960s, there was no need to have the water here. So eventually the city filled in everything in the second channel from Houston Street all the way down to where the water treatment plant is. That was much different than it is today, because that was all done by fill. So I guess what my point here is that we're dealing with a big legacy of history here, much of which we really don't know all the truth about it, because nobody bothered to write anything down or keep any records or get any permission or do anything in the 1860s and 70s. We just went ahead and built this. Now, to the credit of Batavia and to some of my predecessors and whatever, they came back, and I'll give Peg Bond and Phil Elstrom and Art Swanson and Bob Brown and some Jim Hansen, some of them who are really involved in acquiring this particular piece of property, and also building the idea that we would take the depot pond and make it into a recreational area. And I tell you what, you don't need to go very far, and any morning you come down here and we literally, I don't know, I've never counted them, but we have hundreds or dozens of people walking this pond every day. They're walking in behind many of the folks in the audience's homes up there on North Water Street. You know, when we got to the idea that we had the old C&F Ford sitting down there in about the 300 block of North Water Street today, that was one of the most unsightly eyesores we've ever had in Batavia. And fortunately, a couple of young developers came along with the idea that if we would do this thing called the TIF district, it was a new idea at that time, and the city would remove all the contamination up there. We'd pay for that. And we would also pay for the sewer and the water. They would, and the streets, they would come in there and build townhouses, and they would have this nice view of the river. Well, they did, and it all worked, and we've got a beautiful area, and we've gone from what was one of the biggest eyesores in town to one of the most beautiful neighborhoods we have. Then we have John Pitts and Rick Eckblade came along and built the Quarry Stone Pond, and that was another TIF district. I was at a meeting yesterday with the new Speaker of the House of Illinois, and he was talking about, you know, people make fun of the TIF districts, but there in Illinois, there's some really good stories of how that money really has been used to really do some enhancements. And I think Batavia is one of them. So I guess my opinion on this whole thing is, number one, I think that whatever we do here, we need to retain the depot pond in some form or fashion, that the depot pond is here to stay. It's a part of our history. It's a community feature. We have hundreds of people, thousands of people every month probably look at it and admire it. I've got some people wanting to come down from Stoughton, Wisconsin to view Batavia because they hear so many nice things about it. So, I mean, I get that all the time of people wanting to come in and see the stuff we're doing here. And, you know, I think that's very good. The dam that's up there, I'm afraid of it. It's a danger. And we've just recently had an incident where most of you are aware, we had a couple from Geneva get caught up in a boat that they didn't know how to operate. And they came down and got themselves stuck on the top of the depot, on top of the dam when it was at real high water. And I think I saw angels up here because I was standing there when the woman on that boat got off the boat and suddenly got sucked underneath the boat by the water, and her life preserver went off of her. And the next thing we know, we saw all of a sudden her head pops up south of the dam and she's waving at the police and fire, and they went out in the river and got her and she's okay. I don't know how she ever made it through that dam with all that cut stone and everything else that's laying there. It's funny she didn't knock her head off. I mean, that thing is a dangerous thing. We've had over the years, we have had some other incidents up there. We've got a couple for the file. I would tell you, we don't know how these people died. They died in the middle of the night, but they died up around the dam. And we don't know if they fell off, they got sucked in, or whatever happened. So that does not have a real proud history. I mean, dams on the Fox River have a real black mark on them. There's a horrible story out of Elgin where 2 Elgin firemen got killed by being sucked in by the water going over the dam as they were attempting to rescue a boater. There's real bad things about the dam. So I'm not a big fan of keeping that dam there. The other thing we've got is I don't think there's one dam. I think there may be 2. There's the dam you're seeing there that's all cracked up and busted up. And then behind it, there's a concrete dam that was put in prior to the dam that's there now. The new one broke. The old one, I think, is still in the water in some form or fashion in there. So goodness knows what's up there in that stuff. But, you know, I applaud everybody's efforts here, but this is something that I think we need to move cautiously on. And I'm strongly supportive of maintaining the depot pond area, because that really has become a legacy of appearance for downtown Batavia. There's something that makes the town a very special place, and goodness knows we get a lot of tax dollars off of it from the folks that live around it and enjoy it. And, you know, I've got other people looking at other parts of Batavia now to build things along the river because they think our river is a great thing and they can sell apartments or condos to it. So this isn't anything that's going to go away. It's going to get bigger and better as time goes on. So thank you.
Alderman Beck at one point had a hand up. Alderman Beck had her hand up before, but she doesn't now. Did you still want to speak?
Gabby, did you have something you wanted to add?
I know we're running short on time. Do you want to keep going? I can hold it.
You can keep going. We're going to try and wrap this up here in the next 5 minutes. So go ahead.
Okay. I'm going back to an earlier conversation. Could Hitchcock, Lacey, could you describe kind of the difference in water quality from kind of from the letting the river flow to rebuilding the impoundment? Kind of both the positive and negative implications of those.
Sure. Actually, I'll let John from WBK. He probably will be a little bit more eloquent with his explanation.
Yes, you know, the dam creates a situation where there's less velocity, less flow upstream of the dam. When you remove the dam, it creates more turbulent flow, more velocity. When there's stagnant water behind the dam, there's less oxygen in the water, and therefore less conducive for habitat for fish. So as you remove a dam, you increase the velocity at the dam, you remove the stagnant water and create flowing water where there was stagnant water behind the dam. It now becomes flowing water and creates better habitat for fish and better habitat for you know, all the critters that live in the river there. So it's the reason Dam creates kind of anoxic stagnant water, whereas dam removal creates more free-flowing river and better conditions for fish. Hopefully that.
We lost you, John. John, you're muted.
Lacey, can you mute your?
I don't know what that is.
Okay. Yeah, just to reiterate, when there's a dam, it creates stagnant water upstream where sediments settle out, create anoxic conditions in the summer where there's less oxygen for the fish. When you remove a dam, there's more of free flowing water. It removes that stagnant non-free flowing water behind the dam and creates better habitat for fish because there's more oxygen. There's just more flowing water. So that's the primary reason dam removal increases habitat and is better for water quality because it does take away that anoxic condition. That's one of the main problems with dams is the condition of low oxygen behind the dam, and also it collects the sediment where sediment could be harboring, heavy metals, contaminated sediment. That's the other environmental factor mostly related to dams.
And so will options B and E be a more free-flowing river than we have currently, to the point that IDNR obviously feels that it improves the quality enough for fish? Are they just more concerned with fish movement than the actual water quality?
Which options did you say?
B and E. It said down in the low print or the fine print that it had lower water quality. Is that lower than C, D, and A, but still higher than what we currently have? It was just kind of getting a point of reference.
Yeah, it's definitely lower than C, D, and A. So B and E would still create that kind of pool upstream that we have now. So it would be a more stagnant condition upstream. You would have obviously a little more, a longer stretch where the water would be flowing, but instead of just directly over the dam, there would be stair steps. But yes, B and E would still, even though it's a slightly better water quality than what's there now, it would still be considered a low water quality, I believe, from IDNR. They're in their mind, C, D, and A would be the best water quality, and B and E would be secondary. And that's one of their criteria. The other criteria, so again, C, D, and A would be create the safest condition, where B and E would be a less safe condition.
So at this point, what we had hoped to accomplish by the end of today was to identify the concepts that we would then present at a public open house for discussion and comments. Based on tonight's discussion, it sounds like there is still some additional information that both the board and council would like to see before moving to that point. Am I correct there? That there's some cost information that you would like to see refined?
I think it depends on which ones we decided we'd want to have, put forth to the public, because I think if we were to have like any of the C, D, or A options, we would have to have more information, because I wouldn't want to go to the public and say this is an option and then say, well, I don't know how much it's going to cost, to maintain or to build. So I think that to me would be one thing we'd have to have there before we took any one of those. And, I don't know that I feel like I can look around the room and say we got consensus on what we'd like to see. I could be wrong.
And to Alderman Beck's point, I think that there are many in the community who are interested in maximizing the benefits of the health to the river ecology itself. And so if you wouldn't be able to make the decision whether to move C, D, and A forward without the additional cost information, then it sounds like we need to have one more meeting before we do that.
How does the park district feel about that?
I think it would be wise to get some additional information, tighten up the numbers, to be able to make an evaluation as to which to carry forward. I'm gonna challenge the design team with one last thought. We don't have to get into a debate or discussion about it. There was an option that preceded 1 through 5, that was a series of riffles upriver, that were open riffles that would retain water with the dam removed and still maintain Depot Pond. And I don't see it in here as an option, whether it was discarded for safety reasons or something else. But it was a series of riffles that were further north towards the Fabian Park Bridge that would alleviate some of the water quality concerns and still maintain some of the elements that we've discussed here tonight. So if I am recalling that.
From my memory, from when we did that, and I'm putting together stuff that I've got at home back from 2003, when I first got on the city council and we went through this, the last time that I remember. That one I think was discounted because it put so many more tons of concrete back in the river than what we would remove. And because they were so far upriver, they didn't guarantee the level of the Depot Pond.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to go back and find that again, but I believe that that's the reason why that one was discounted.
Okay, then you have a little more information than I recall, so I'll take your word for it at this point.
And maybe Hitchcock can find that in what historical information they have. So I think at this point, if we could get better numbers on what they think, even just the initial costs or a range for operational costs would be on pumping for whatever of the, what was it, A, C, and D that we had there. Yeah, C, D, and A that we had there. Then we could decide, I think one more meeting, we decide which one of these 5 or all of these 5 or 2 out of the 5, whatever we decide to go with, that's what we would go to the public forum with. I think that's where we need to be. You know, because I think if we put 5 out there, we're never going to get a decision if we go publicly with that.
I would concur.
I agree with you.
One last question.
Sure. Use your mic.
Is there any way to, they bring up this great idea of what we're putting back into the river. Is there a way to understand, with taking out the dam, with these different concepts, how much is being put back in, whether it be, estimated for a park or for the rock tiers, how much are we putting back in? I'd be interested in
like cubic yards.
Well,
because that's how they're going to quantify it.
I mean, just an idea so we can understand that and compare that, because if we're saying that we're taking out 3 cubic yards, yet with some of these concepts we're putting in 6, is that what we really want?
That actually was the same point I was making, though, is that's the great unknown, right? I don't think anybody knows that, and it's like, and then we don't know what the quality of that dirt is, whether or not we can put anything back. And that's kind of the question I was posing, is that what is this dirt that we would be dredging? And is it even of a quality that we can have a solid structure made from it, park, or, returning something like you're saying to, the river to have some sort of foundation? We have no idea. And that's what really makes me nervous about options of dredging, is that you don't know what you're going to find as far as quality and what you're going to have to replace with a better product that's going to cost you more money.
Well, even putting additional rock and an additional dam, like you can see, we're putting more material in there. Is it to build those? Is that going to be more material than what we're taking out?
Totally agree with you. Yeah.
So I don't know if there's some way, maybe even going off, and I know that it's different from the Oswego concept. It's bigger and different, but is there some sort of estimate that we might be able to get based on that to kind of get an idea?
Yeah, I think the big unknown for us is when we go to start taking that out, how much concrete comes out from basically the 2 dams that are there. the one that's underlying and the one that we can see. And then all the sediment that's there, what do we do with that? What can be done with it? We don't know till we get it out. I mean, it's not like you can go out and drill into the silt and then figure out exactly what's there. When it comes out and it's in the truck and they test it, that's when they can tell. And that was one of the big questions we had the first time, or the last time that we went through this, is those were questions we couldn't answer. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't make a decision in time and Yorkville got the money to do the dam. We were both in there at the same time to try to figure out who was going to get the money from the state to do it. Yorkville got their plan ready, got their stuff together, and they did theirs. When they were done, we didn't have any money left from the state.
Well, there
why
was,
we had for
very,
18
there was a
years.
very public death on that dam that forced the IDNR into that. That
Right,
was,
in Yorkville.
yeah.
I mean,
So I think right now we had tentatively scheduled public open house for July 29th. Do you think it's possible for this group to meet sometime next week to, and Hitchcock, would you be ready with the additional information that's been requested next week?
this is John Woody. If I may interject, for option C, the dredging option, the only way we're going to know the condition of that soil that's dredged out and whether that's suitable for fill is to actually have a geotechnical firm go out, take borings of that material, test it, which is, an effort in and itself. The only thing for this conceptual option, the only thing as far as estimating costs that we can do with a reasonable level of effort would be to determine exactly, is to assume that all that material is unsuitable and to haul that off and bring in new material. That would be the most expensive way to do it. But that's without geotechnical testing of the soil. We're really our hands tied as to how much material would be suitable for reuse.
Hey, John, Alderman Miller here. Do your numbers reflect what you just said? That you're assuming all new fill, that stuff is unusable?
Our assumption was that a portion of that would be reused. We assumed approximately 40% would be reused. But that would have to be reassessed. And in these conceptual, for option C, we still don't have a clear picture of, is that park level with the top of the bank, or is that a few feet down? It makes a big difference on volume because it is a large area. What that looks like. We would love to have kind of a better picture of an idea of what is envisioned for that area, whether it's filled into the top of bank or whether it's depressed a couple feet from what it is now. There's some variables there that are still unknown for us to. The more information we have, the better we can nail down those numbers.
I would assume if you are trying to quantify the number of fill, you would assume just filling the whole thing with new dirt at the current level that it's at. That would give us better numbers for us to at least start with.
Well, and it would have to be, to me, it would have to be against probably one of the highest historical floods we've had, so that would not be within the floodplain, because if you don't do that, it's going to flood.
Has it flooded over what we've got out here now?
The guesstimate was wrong when they built the bike path on the other side of the river, and we can only use it for X quantity of months during the year because it's not high enough. I don't want to see that happen if we did something different with this.
So yeah, so whatever they quantify needs to be that, assuming not reusing any fill,
right?
Any dredging or any existing material.
Okay, yeah, that gives me some more information to go on and kind of refine these numbers a little bit.
Laura, can I make a suggestion? I think I'd rather have the design team take the time they need to get us some firmer numbers, since we're going to be using this as the basis for which we're going to carry forward to the public, that rather than driving the 29th as a hard, fast date, I would rather get the information and give the design team enough time to move it. My other concern is, I think on the 29th, if you historically look at it, it's the #1 vacation week of the entire year. So I want to make sure that our public meeting is well attended, since this is such a big decision for the community.
Yeah. So,
It had been tentative. We'll just take that off as a to be determined.
yeah, and I think once we've made our determination of what the options are going to be that we're going to have presented there and the data that we feel confident with, then we'll set the public meeting date at that point.
That sounds
I
good.
think,
So
I think that would be easier than constantly pushing it back, or, you know, we've got a lot of people that are very interested in this, so we want to make sure that we get as many of them at that meeting
Mhm.
when that happens.
So staff will put our heads together with Hitchcock Design Group
Okay.
to determine the length of time that they need to put these numbers together. Eric and I will work with you and with the park board to determine what date we can bring this back for a discussion with those numbers, and have that drive when we reschedule the public open houses.
One more.
All right.
One more quick comment.
Mark, go
Because
ahead.
you just mentioned it with flooding. It would be interesting to know, not that I support CDNA or C&D, certainly I do not. Least of the other three, but anyway, from a flooding standpoint, the highest level that the river has gotten, not necessarily the highest level, but common levels that it gets
Mhm.
to, how tall does that berm have to be to keep the river from destroying whatever's created in that new park space if you do something like C&D? Again, I don't support it, but that ends up being another factor.
Right. And that's what I'm saying is I think that has to be looked at, because not only are we trying to protect this building, River Rain, and whatever, you know, is the depot pond or is in place of the depot pond, all those things have to come into play to figure out what level that has to be. And that completely affects the cost of that because of the surface area of it. Okay, Pat, thank you for hanging with us through a little bit longer than normal meeting here.
No, we appreciate the dialogue. So just to allow you guys to carry on, I will entertain a motion to adjourn at 7:28 for the park board.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Tillman, second by Gray. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you very much for the great conversation.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right,
everybody.
thank everybody that came down tonight for being patient and listening to us deliberate over this. And when we get through the next step, we'll let you know.
Thank you for your cooperation and partnership.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks to Hitchcock for presenting everything tonight for us. And I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn special session of committee of the whole.
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, we will take a 5-minute break and then we'll start committee of the whole meeting.